Hello everybody and welcome back to Street Style. This week we're going to begin our history of street style by looking at the early years. And we're going to learn how subcultures would appropriate a certain mode of dress as an identifier. Really, the birth of street style. A style and mode of dressing that ran counter to the mainstream. As we discussed last week, throughout history people have used clothing to set themselves apart from fashion's mainstream. Remember, we discussed the sans-culottes of the French Revolution, who would wear their red and cream stripes to show that they were not royalists, that they were revolutionaries. They used clothing very deliberately. Equally, we could mention the bloomer girls of the 19th century. Women who did not want to wear crinolines and hoop skirts and would wear long baggy bloomers to express their anti-fashion stance. However, these groups were small and they don't really reflect street style in the way that we have come to understand it, but I mention them so that you know that there has always been an element of society that rebel against the mainstream through clothing. But it was really after World War I, they are the dates of World War I, 1914 to 1918, that street style as we know it started to appear. And by street style in eras other than our present era, we are talking about clothing worn by a particular group that ran counter to mainstream fashion and was used to show allegiance to a lifestyle, philosophy, taste, and social mores of that particular group. So in this lecture, we'll be looking at the street style of countercultures and subcultures in the first half of the 20th century. Not all of them, because of course there were tons, but we're going to look at the main street style countercultures, the ones that would go on to inform mainstream fashion later on. And we're going to start with a subject that I know you love, the flappers. Before we even begin to discuss flappers, please be aware that there were very few real flappers in the 1920s. The phenomenon of the 20s flapper was amplified and exaggerated during the Deco revival of the 1970s. Most women in the 20s were certainly not flappers, which is why flappers are a genuine subculture. And this handful of genuine flappers were really something else. I should explain what happened to fashion globally in the mainstream after World War I. World War I was a terrible conflict. Nearly an entire generation of young men lost their lives in the fields of Flanders. This meant that in the 1920s, jobs that had formerly been taken by men could be taken by women. At the same time, women in America won the vote. In most states, women won the right to vote in 1920. So in the 20s, we see the birth of the modern woman, working, being more independent. Don't be deceived in thinking that women in the 1920s were remotely as independent as we are today. But there was a certain change, which is why hemlines were raised, which is why corsetry was abandoned. It was a modern world and women were working in it. However, some women used fashion to set themselves apart from the mainstream, and these women were flappers. To be a flapper, you really had to hem your skirts above your knees. Most women in the 20s, although their skirts were shockingly short and fell below the knees, and that was shocking, that had never happened before, a flapper would take things to a higher extreme. Why were they called flappers? Well, the general belief is that they earned this moniker based on their footwear. They wore unbuckled galoshes with the buckles unfastened so that the tongue of their boots would flap as they walk. But this is false, I'm afraid. The term flapper actually dates back as early as the 1890s, likening modern young women to baby birds flapping their wings as they learn to fly. But you know what? Even by the time we get into the mid-1920s, people had forgotten this original usage of the word flapper and were of the belief, even in the 20s, that the word sprung from the unbuckled galoshes. Yet even in the 20s, the idea of women wearing unbuckled galoshes was extremely shocking. Why did these young women do it? To set themselves apart. Flappers flaunt fads in footwear. Unbuckled galoshes flop around their legs and winter sport shoes emphasize their feet. Stockings scare dogs. Look at this, New York Times, January 29th, 1922. So these women were using clothing to create a subculture. Being a vaguely emancipated woman wasn't enough for them. They took things to extremes. As you can see here, she is not wearing galoshes, but she's showing an awful lot of leg. Flappers would smoke cigarettes in public. Believe it or not, in the earlier century it was illegal for women to smoke in public. And in the 1920s, if a woman did smoke, she would not smoke in public, even if she was wearing a skirt that was hemmed to her knees. A flapper, however, would smoke in public. Look at these genuine flappers here. You know they are genuine flappers because of their footwear. Look at the woman on the left with her galoshes unbuckled. So you see, not every woman in a shift dress and a cloche hat in the 1920s was a flapper. Most women were not. Flappers were a subculture who used fashion, particularly the hemlines of their skirts being higher and these galoshes, as the sartorial expression of the freedom that they wanted. Here is another great image of a flapper. Look at her footwear. But fellas, guys, were also using fashion to create subcultures in the 1920s. Collegiate street-style trends of the 20s are very memorable, and they were worn by college boys originally, but then boys who didn't go to college appropriated many of these street-style trends, like the raccoon coat. These enormous coats made of raccoon. This was a genuine street-style trend. And here is a guy in the 20s wearing an enormous raccoon coat. This street-style trend became so enormous. Look at this poster here, this ad, the favorite of college men, Gunther Raccoon Coats. Headquarters for raccoon coats on 5th Avenue at 36th Street, not so far from our college, right? But this was a street-style trend that only young men appropriated. Like these young men. So you can see, what were these guys doing by wearing these raccoon coats? They were saying, 1, they were young. 2, they were in college, even though eventually young, hip people who were not in college appropriated the raccoon trend. But it was creating a subculture, a collegiate subculture, because not every guy who went to college would wear a raccoon coat. But those who did were identifying with each other, creating this very trendy subculture. It became such a talking point that it even featured here in this Norman Rockwell illustration on the Saturday Evening Post. You see these college boys here in full song, all wearing raccoon coats. But as I just said, it soon impacted non-collegiate life. Take a look at this wonderful couple here in New York, and she is wearing a raccoon coat as well. And eventually this street-style subculture element, this raccoon coat, would filter up to high fashion. So look at this picture here and ask yourself, is this street style? Well, no, it's just ladies on the street, but they are wearing something that originated with street style. Now today, as I keep mentioning, we call anyone who doesn't work in fashion and is photographed on the street as an example of street style. In our history of street style, we are talking really genuinely about subcultures who identified themselves with their clothing And then, as you see here with these two ladies, some of these elements of clothing would filter up to either high fashion or mainstream retail. This all makes sense to you, right? Another big collegiate street style trend of the 1920s was the Letterman sweater. Now this would come back again with the baby boom of the 1950s, but it originated in the 20s. And here is a wonderful picture of some lettermen, as they were known. So the letter on their sweaters, oh, that rhymes, the letter on his sweater. The letters on their sweaters obviously showed allegiance to their college or to their team, right? But then these college boys would wear these sweaters not just to games. They would wear them if they went out on a casual date. They would wear them if they went out shopping, if they were hanging out with friends. So it became a fashion look beyond its original function of supporting a team. Here is another great picture of some chaps in the 1920s with their Letterman sweaters on. And this is Donna Karan, I believe, 2014, and you can see that these street-style elements, dating back as far as the 1920s, still influence and inspire fashion today. And one of the silliest collegiate fashion fads of the 20s were these pants. They were known as Oxford bags. Bags because they were so huge and baggy, and Oxford because they originally started with the undergrads, the undergraduate male population of Oxford University in London. This became such a huge fad that it gained a lot of media attention. Here is a publicity photograph, of course, of somebody having the hem of his enormous Oxford bags measured. These trousers became so huge that colleges started banning them. Did this filter up to regular men in the 1920s? No, it didn't. This was a fad that really only stayed within that collegiate sub. As I'm sure you all know, prohibition was a feature of the 1920s. It was illegal to make, sell, buy, or drink alcohol in the United States, which of course didn't stop people from boozing it up regularly. And the illegal manufacture and distribution of alcohol saw the birth of organized crime, the mafia. So let's take a look at original gangster style, because this definitely counts as street style. Here are a few 1920s gangsters, and their look was very oversized. Double-breasted coats and jackets with very wide lapels, a lot of pinstripe, slightly oversized hats, flashy ties. Here are a whole group of gangsters being photographed here, and you can see it was rather flashy. It may not look flashy to our eye today, but it was certainly very flashy then. Velvet-trimmed collars, hats that were a little bit oversized, a lot of wide lapels, double-breasted features. I think we all know what a 1920s gangster looks like. But many elements drawn from 20s gangster style would then be appropriated by the Swing-Jugend and the Pachuco subcultures in the following decades, which we'll look at in a second. And some of these elements still read as anti-establishment signifiers today, don't they? The 1930s, of course, is marked by the Great Depression. Wall Street crashed on October 24th, 1929, and the world, especially America, was thrown into a terrible time of hardship. It was the era of mass unemployment and breadlines, of Hoovervilles. Hooverville was the name given to these shanty towns that would spring up all over the country because, of course, people lost their homes, so many people had to resort to living in these ramshackle shanty towns that were called Hoovervilles after President Hoover, because he was the president when Wall Street crashed. And of course, in our prairie states, it was the time of the Dust Bowl, the horrible dust blizzards where crops died, cattle died, a time of tremendous hardship, mass unemployment, and with that mass unemployment, there was an increase, of course, in crime, and we get the phenomenon of the street gang. Street gangs made up of young people of the 1930s were given the name dead-end kids. If you were in a street gang, you were a dead-end kid. And they too had their own particular clothing signifiers. Plus fours, you see these sort of bloomer type of trousers here called plus fours. Also a flat cap, a flat tweed often cap. This is how dead-end kids dressed. They were street gangs. They were scallywags. Now, here's the thing. In the 1930s, a series of movies came out that starred the same ensemble cast who were known as the Dead-End Kids. And in the movies, the Dead-End Kids were secretly quite nice kids, and they had all kinds of adventures. So the Dead-End Kids were... this idea was immediately appropriated by the mainstream, and because of the movies, many just young pubescent, prepubescent, and young teens started dressing this way. Remember how I said that a lot of the 1920s gangster attire would be appropriated by youth subcultures a little later on? Now I am going to demonstrate this by telling you about Svingjugend, which is very difficult for me to say, Svingjugend, because it is German. I do not speak one word of German. Moi, je parle français. I speak French. German, So I'll translate it. Swing youth. Svingjugend means swing youth, or swing kids. Who were the swing kids? Well, a little mini history lesson first. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. By the mid-1930s, going into the late 1930s, swing music, American swing, had hit Germany. Swing is a type of jazz. It's very, very fast. It's very exciting, and you dance the jitterbug to it. You'll be hearing some of it in a second. Now, as I'm sure you know, when Hitler came to power, he was pretty insistent that all of the young of Germany, people under 18, join the Hitler Youth movement and go goose-stepping around. Well, not every kid in Germany wanted to do this. Swing kids did not want to dress in those little khaki shorts with swastikas, goose-stepping and going Sieg Heil. They were into swing music. They were against National Socialism. Of course, that was Hitler's party, the National Socialists. Swing kids, as they were known, basically just wanted to listen to swing music. People like Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, this kind of music, Glenn Miller, and dance the jitterbug. Really, that was their agenda. Now, there were more political elements of this subculture, swing youth. The Edelweiss Pirates, for example. These were young boys and girls who were much more politically active, would hand out pamphlets that were anti-Nazi, and you can imagine the kind of trouble they would get into. Here you see some original Svingjugend, some swing kids here. And do you remember what I said about appropriating gangster culture and gangster attire? Look at the pinstripe suits, look at the double-breasted jackets, and also look at the very wide trousers, which are almost like Oxford bags. Now, swing kids loved American things, so they saw gangster culture of the 1920s as being very cool and, above all, very American, and this is what they wanted to appropriate. They also liked trench coats, right? They wore these long trench coats because they saw the trench coat as being something very American. So you can imagine how well this went down with Hitler. He saw swing music as being incredibly degenerate. He thought jazz was degenerate. Why? Innocent jazz. Swing is great fun. Well, think about it. Swing has its roots in jazz, and jazz is an African American musical genre. And of course, Hitler was all about Aryan things. Oh, you couldn't be black, you couldn't be Jewish, you couldn't be gay, you couldn't be Romany, which is gypsy. So he saw the music as being very anti-Aryan. Secondly, he thought that all of the youth in Nazi Germany should be in the Hitler Youth movement. They should be goose-stepping around and listening to Wagner. He hated the swing kids. So basically, he sent his heavies, his henchmen, out to round up the swing kids. If they didn't conform to Hitler's agenda, if they didn't join the Hitler Youth, and particularly if they carried on listening to swing music. If you look at these very young boys over here on the left in their pinstriped suits, trying to look all American as they dance the swing in their swing clubs, it'll strike you as so unbelievably awful and tragic that they had to change these stripes for another kind of stripe. Yeah, swing kids, if they didn't conform, ended up in the concentration camps and were killed. So, swing youth is a really important element because obviously this was a subculture, but a subculture that was instantly recognizable by the way they dressed. I want to now show you just a little clip from a documentary about swing youth so you can hear some youth culture, some swing music, learn about the youth culture of this German subculture in the era by a very old man who fortunately survived the roundup and execution of so many of his friends in Nazi Germany.
How many children escaped indoctrination? It's impossible to know. As 10 years of Nazi rule passed by, the Hitler Youth lost its appeal as something exciting. It was now compulsory, backed up by Gestapo laws and busybody Hitler Youth patrols. More and more, the rebellious thing was to refuse to join. These photographs are the only surviving pictures of German youth gangs in the early 1940s. The Edelweiss Pirates, the Texas Band, the Navajos. They beat up Nazi officials, wrote graffiti on walls, but mostly they just hung out and listened to American jazz. Their casual, fun-loving attitude made a mockery of Nazi control.
They dance outrageously. They call it swing. Sometimes two boys with one girl, sometimes all together in a wild circle. Girls wear lipstick and paint their nails. It's monstrous.
I remember one time when a group of jazzers had gathered on the pier to play Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, not disturbing anyone. But jazz was un-German, and so the self-important Hitler Youth leader marches up and orders them to stop this Jewish nonsense. But the jazzers stripped his clothes off, stuffed the most disgusting things into his mouth, I will not say what, and they chucked him in the river by this huge outflow. The whole thing took no more than a few minutes.
The government hit back. Curfews were ordered to stop young people visiting bars after 9 o'clock. Hanging round and smoking in public were banned. Forced labor for those that broke the rules, or death. This photo shows the fate of 12 young Edelweiss pirates caught in Cologne in '44.
Equally famous in the story of street style as the swing kids were the Zoot Suiters of the early 1940s, also known as Pachucos. I'm not going to talk too much about them because your viewing assignment this week is to watch an absolutely fascinating documentary about the Pachucos and their girlfriends The Black Widows, and it is an extraordinary story of how clothing was used so strongly to identify a street culture and how all of this would erupt in something called the Zoot Suit Riots. It's a really great documentary. You're going to enjoy it, and we're going to discuss it in the discussion board, so do make sure you watch it all. So although I'm not going to talk too much about the Zoot Suiters, because that's for your viewing assignment, I just want you to get a visual read on how extraordinary Zoot Suits were. These very long jackets with wide lapels, high-waisted, incredibly voluminous pants that were still, if you look at the bottom there, hemmed in tight at the bottom. Huge hats. It really was an extraordinary look. Please remember, though, at the time of the Zoot Suiters, World War II was raging and fabric was rationed. Right? So you could only buy Zoot Suits on the black market. The Zoot Suiters are associated with Los Angeles, although they did appear really in almost every urban center in the United States. And here is a Zoot Suiter. I'd like you to note the long watch chain dangling down his leg there, and that is his girlfriend. The girlfriends of Zoot Suiters were often known as Black Widows because they would wear all black. And take a look at her jacket. You see she has taken on a few of the clothing elements of her boyfriend there, that very long jacket with the very wide lapels. In the documentary, you will learn about the Zoot Suit Riots, and you'll be surprised to see how fashion, as always, causes more trouble than it's worth sometimes. But the Zoot Suit is still an influence on some designers today. So enjoy this documentary. It really is a wonderful example of how a subculture identified with their street style so strongly that it actually impacted American history. And it will also remind you of the relationship between street style and street crime, which we have seen already, haven't we, with organized crime of the 1920s. We saw it with the Dead End Kids in the 1930s. We saw it in a way with the swing youth. They weren't doing anything wrong, but their dominant mainstream government thought that they were. Do we still associate street style with crime? No, we don't really, do we? But for a lot of the 20th century we did, and all of this is polarized in this wonderful documentary, which will also remind you that until very recently, our understanding of street style really was the domain of the young. So when you head over to the viewing assignment, as you're watching it, make a few points. Note down if you have any questions or what you found particularly interesting, because the documentary on the Zoot Suit Riots is going to be the topic for our discussion board. By the end of World War II, the baby boom came about, and by the middle of the following decade, the 1950s, a whole new street-style demographic would emerge. That's right, the teenager. Oh, but not the good teenager, no, the naughty teenager. And we are going to meet the greasers, the rockers, the teddies, and their offshoots next week. Until then, enjoy the assignment, and I'll see you over on our discussion board.